Well, thank you, Bridget, for that great introduction. And thank you also to Fotofest and Stephen Evans and his team for asking me to become involved with this project and for having invited me here so that I can present what we discovered to you. So because we have a lot of material, I'm going to kind of launch into it straight away so that there's enough time for you to ask questions about it. Now, I'll just say very briefly that I left India myself 50 years ago to live in Montreal, in this part of the world in a way, up in the north. And I first came to Houston 30 years ago. So on and off, I've had a little bit of dealings with this side and that side. But a frequent question on this side is always kind of like, where do you come from? And so I say India. And in the early years, it was a very mysterious place. Very few people I met had very little idea about it, other than perhaps it's where hippies went, it's where drugs came from, or possibly it was in dire need of some development funding. So it's been a kind of lifelong, if you like, a passion and interest to bring India, to make it more accessible, to bring it out in the world, and especially in this field, my field of photography. And it's nice to see old colleagues there. Anne Tucker, she'll remember, we had a lot of discussions about this in Oracle. Where was India in the history of photography? So many years later, here it is. I'm going to start now with what we decided was that rather than focus on a few practices, we would give you a very overall picture of what's coming in March. So it's a kind of broad, brief look at almost everybody whose work you'll see eventually. And it's just alphabetical. It's not in any other kind of order as yet. So I wanted to start, luckily we're starting here. So this is a fantastic place for me because we're starting with a queer image. This is a series of pictures of drag kings. It's by a young photographer based in Bangalore. And it's very symbolic of what's happened in India. You know, 15 years ago, you couldn't mention the word lesbian and gay. It was illegal. It's still illegal. But a big change has happened. People are mentioning it. People are making work. Young people like this photographer are impatient to have rights and to be able to represent themselves. So this series of drag kings are actually very located in the culture as well. These are characters that come out of South Indian popular culture. So moving on, this is Pablo Bartholomew. By the way, the work we decided would be contemporary, so most of it, all of it's post-2000, except a handful of these pictures. Pablo Bartholomew is a very well-known Indian photojournalist, and he's been documenting the Indian diaspora. A lot of Indians came to North America to work as farmers. He's been going to various European countries, and in this case, he's in Mauritius. Mauritius, like the Caribbean and like Fiji in the Pacific, was where Indian indentured labor was taken by the British to work sugarcane. This is work by Atul Bhalla, who you might have seen in the last Biennial. He has an ongoing interest in water. He's a fine artist primarily who uses photography quite a lot in his work, and he uses multiples quite a lot. This is another series of public drinking water facilities around the city of Delhi. This is Mohini Chandra. She's from Fiji. This is a 3-channel video, actually. This is just an image from it. She's the child of a family that was brought there as indentured labor. And this Kikau street is the street that they lived on. And then basically in this video she talks about the family's experience of arriving in Fiji and then her departure from Fiji. Shilpa Chachi is an artist who I've worked with for a very long time as a curator. She was in my original exhibition called An Economy of Science in 1990 at the Photographers Gallery in London, which was about India by Indians, also a bit like this, except there were only 8 of them. But back in 1990, people didn't think there was any such thing as an Indian photographer. Shilpa Chachi has actually become a well-established fine artist and won a prize in Switzerland this year. This is an installation that's 26 foot tall, and it involves strips of film or celluloid that rotate. And we'll have another piece by her, which is quite fabulous. This is again a mobile. So it's a moving. It's like layers of image that move. And what it, as the caption says, it's 70 different words for water in Sanskrit. And that's her, actually. It's a self-portrait of her from the back. This is Serena Chopra, who has made a career later in life. She's a new photographer, but in her 40s. And she makes these black and white studies, documentary, I guess you might say, but particularly of these marginal people. So this is a series on the Tibetans in Delhi. Majnu Ka Tilla is a part of New Delhi where Tibetan refugees live. And so to kind of, in a way, go with that, there's work by Tenzing Dapka, who's Tibetan himself and who's very young. So we found people for this biennial who are across quite a wide age range and experience range. So Tenzing just graduated last year from RISD and was on his way back to India when we met in New York. His family runs a hotel, and it's been the subject of his work. So Tibetans in India, as you can imagine, are living on a kind of knife edge because they're not sure if they will ever be able to return to Tibet. What I find interesting, though, as a curator, is that although we're tying them together by their ethnicity, they do come from very different places and studied in very different places. And because I teach, I'm becoming aware of how much the schooling is having an impact. So although we're reclaiming him as an Indian photographer, it's undeniably there are traces of RISD that will never go away. So, yeah. This is Sarandon Dhaliwal. She's Canadian. And this is an autobiographical piece. She was born in India and she was brought to England as a baby. And then when she was a teenager, she was moved to Toronto, which she didn't like at all. So she ran away and came back to England and went to art school. But was after that, had no means of survival, so had to go back and live in Toronto. And this is kind of about her biography from Punjab to London to Toronto and back. So this is Anita Dubey, who's now a very well-known Indian fine artist, who's also going to be the curator of the next Kochi Biennial. This is a much earlier work of hers from 2004, where she's also in drag as a fictional character. And this fictional character is a Muslim young man, and in 2004 he's talking back to the growing fascism and the right-wing Hindu state that's developing around him. India, for many of us, was a secular country, and he talks about his anxieties as to what's happening to his society. It's a 15-minute impromptu monologue to camera. And then there's another series by her, which are all still lives of her home in Delhi. The I-32 tower is her address. She's a sculptor, actually, by training. We're also hoping to have this body of work. It's Jannat by Gauri Gill, who you may have heard of. She's been shown a bit now on the East Coast. This particular series of work is about this young woman. She's lived in Rajasthan. Gauri has made Rajasthan a focal region for her work, and she was concentrating on young women in that region. And unfortunately, this young woman died as a teenager. So she dedicated a project. She edited out about 50 pictures, and they've made a series that we're going to show here. And it's both the photographs of this young girl's life, and it's also an exchange of postcards and notes to each other. Chandan Gomes is a very young photographer also. He comes from a very particular low-income background in New Delhi, but because he was Catholic, he was able to attend private Catholic schools and a college, and so there was a kind of split between his daily life at school and his home life. And he talks in this project about how it took him a long time to reconcile his very humble home with the kind of privileged school that he was going to. And so this body of work, he's photographed his home in an effort to try to come to terms with it. The Christians are one of the minorities of India. We have work by Shilpa Gupta, who's a very successful fine artist at the moment. She works normally with new media and technology, but sometimes with photography as well. So we're going to have this as a very large print on the outside of the Fotofest building, we hope. And inside, we're going to have this fun piece. It's very interactive. The shadows are actual people, so the audience is the audience's shadows, and stuff happens on the screen that they interact with. There's another Gupta. I'm sorry, I haven't filled it with Guptas because I'm a Gupta, but there's just quite a lot of we are a very popular caste, actually. It's the most populous caste in India. Now, Shivani Gupta, on the other hand, is a much younger person. She's just emerging into the exhibition scene. These are quite fabulous. She's been trying to kind of, I wouldn't say document, but her subject are indigenous people who live in Ladakh, which is the very northern part of India, next to Kashmir, between Kashmir and China. It's got a very amazing scenery as well. And it's printed on a kind of fabric, isn't it, or linen or something, and they hang freely in space. And so she makes these sort of slightly fantastical elements in the landscape. She's trying to incorporate the indigenous fairy tales into her kind of documentation of the people. It's an interesting, complex way of approaching something. Okay, so then now we kind of felt we had to address some of the major issues of India that have become the subject of social documentary photographers, which is an area that's very strong in India. India's got a very big print industry, which is fed by photojournalism, but a number of younger photographers are getting very much more involved, I would say, in trying to engage, I think, with socially responsible projects as they see it. I think if you live in a country like India, you really can't turn your back on what's happening. It's kind of a bit unlike the developed world, where I think socially responsible photojournalism is kind of on the wane. I think the next picture is missing, so we'll move on. But basically, it's a story about, I'll go back to this one. This is a story about mining. This is a forest, an ancient forest of sandalwood. It's occupied by indigenous people, and it's been discovered there's 14 years worth of coal underneath this forest. So the coal industry has arrived. And so it's the usual kind of struggle between the industry, the state, the military, and the indigenous people who are trying to hold on to their way of life. Okay, here's another Gupta, but he's a Maharashtrian one, so his name is a bit different. So this is somebody from Bombay, or what's now called Mumbai, and he is completely besotted with his city, and he's been shooting it for a number of years in just seeing what he sees. I thought, and Stephen agreed, that it was quite a fabulous and fun project. There's nothing very theoretical about it. It's just somebody who's enthralled with the place where they live. This, on the other hand, is much more theoretical. This is a video installation, plus some still images and so on. Abhishek Hazra came and made this work in London at a place called Gasworks, a kind of artist residency center. It's called Shouting Needham from the Rooftops, and I'll try and explain it to you. What we are seeing in the video is the Bengali language. So the visual is a language, which I quite like, because we're trying to approach photography as a visual in many ways, including the text. So text itself becomes the visual. So in this case, the Bengali we are seeing is actually a phonetic transliteration of English. So it's a kind of in-joke, if you like. So what he did was, in the East End of London, around Brick Lane, there's a kind of very big Bangladeshi community. So there are mosques where there's a call to prayer. So what he did was to mimic this call to prayer, but instead of using the Quran, he used this book by this man called Needham, and Mr. Needham, who's English, studied medieval Chinese scientific thought. And so Abhishek was reading out these texts about medieval Chinese medicine, but he translated them into Bengali. So for the people who heard this assumed it was a call to prayer. So he was playing on this kind of idea that culturally we just assume many things. We assume that they're Muslim, we assume it's a call to prayer, and it unleashes all our fears about Islam and Muslims. But actually it's this very kind of complicated scientific text. And so that was the idea, that there's this disconnect between what you hear, what you understand, and how you kind of emotionally react to just language. This is Saurabh Hura, who's a very young photographer, who's currently an associate member of Magnum. And this particular series we like because it's one of the rare works by Indian photographers that's not about India, but it's about over here. So he traveled up and down the Mississippi. Actually, he was kind of repeating a journey that his father had made. His father had gone down the Mississippi on a boat. But Saurabh was doing this actually with Alex Soth. He worked with Alex Soth from Magnum, and the pair of them were traveling. And these are all in black and white. So meanwhile, back in India itself is this young man, Manoj Kumar Jain. He's been also photographing the indigenous people of central India who are equally locked in some kind of struggle for survival. But what he's done is to take these very rather beautiful, studied, almost fashion-like pictures of them. And of course the lifestyle. I think it's quite a spectacular set of pictures also, this one. He's not as successful on the global stage, I think partly because he doesn't speak English. And that's one of the tragedies of India, is that it's still divided by many things, and it's still divided by those who can and those who cannot speak English. This is this very interesting work by Jitish Kalat called Covering Letter. Covering letter refers to the letter that was written by Gandhi to Hitler before the outbreak of the Second World War, in which Gandhi is imploring Hitler, please do not start a war. So this is an actual historical document. And this is, in fact, it's a moving thing, so I have to show you the video. So as you can see, it's a fog machine. The letter's projected through it on the floor. And it's quite interactive. People like to get very engaged with it. You can walk through it and do kind of fun things with it. Roshni Kempadu, she's Guyanese, Trinidadian, British, and also has a background of indentured labor in her family. So she's been back and forth, and she's been back to photograph plantations in Trinidad and Guyana with the ghosts of the people who were brought there. This is Asif Khan. He's a photojournalist in India. He documented many things. This example that we're getting is this place called Muzaffarnagar, which is this unfortunately slightly typical story of our times, where there's a lot of internal trouble and strife, and rioting and all of that, which creates a kind of internal refugee problem, and that people get displaced, and then they feel too frightened to go back home, and then these refugee camps become more permanent and structured. So meanwhile, back in the West, now we're in England. This is in Birmingham. you might have heard we've had the Brexit business in Britain, and what it's done is to unleash again a new wave of a kind of fascism. I don't know what else to call it, but so the Brits want to also go back to the time when they were great, presumably to the days of empire. So what's happened is the streets have become unsafe for people of color. So something we hadn't seen since the 1970s. There's a return of white kids attacking people and abusing them. So this particular photographer has photographed a number of Indian young people who've been abused on the streets just in this past year. And the popular kind of abuse is "you fucking packy." So I think we just wanted to kind of note that this is also happening. This is another project that's trying to document the communal problems of India. This is in Kashmir, where, depending on your point of view, there's a kind of very problematic presence of the Indian military, much resisted by the locals. The locals have taken to stoning the military. The military has responded by shooting pellets at them. And so this is a photographic series of evidence. There's a whole set of portraits of the people who've been shot, accompanied by X-rays, which show where the pellets are, because these shotgun pellets can't be removed. So the people have to learn to live with them, embedded inside their bodies. Sandeep Kuriakose is a recent graduate from the Indian art schools. He's Delhi-based and also a young queer artist who will be making these collages. We have 2 different series of these. So it's coming from a whole layering thing. So this is a physical set that's made and then photographed. This is a virtual layering, so this is then printed as a screen print. Dhruv Malhotra is also a young photographer who was able to come and study at ICP and then is back in India. And he made this series about all shot at night in a newish kind of suburb of Delhi called Noida. And it's quite unusual in a way because people don't really see it like that. The night in India is very different from the day. It doesn't have that bustling scene. This is probably the most hard-hitting photojournalism kind of documentary work we have, and it's depicting really one of the biggest issues and problems of Indian society today, which is the caste system. We haven't managed to get rid of it. And he's looking at the people at the bottom end of the caste system. People are loath to even handle, to kind of physically approach them. And so this project looks at what happens when they die. Nobody will touch the bodies. So what they do is they bring in people from the same community and just into the morgue and say, okay, you do it. It's your people, you have to do it. Because the normal undertakers won't deal with the bodies of these sort of so-called this particular caste of people. So this person who's made this work, he's a graduating student. So he's very young, and I think when you're very young, you're really outraged, and he's able to go right to the heart of the matter, completely unflinching. He just looks at it, straight at it. That's a really powerful set of pictures. And I've not seen anything like this by anybody older. So this is somebody who you might know, because I think she's had some work here before. Anu Matthews is an American Indian, or an Indian American, and she's made this work, of course, about being Indian American. And it's this play. She's remade herself in the style of classic pictures of American Indians. This is by a rare person, a Muslim woman who makes photography. There were not many of those, although we have tried to be very diverse in our selection, but you'd be hard-pressed to find Muslim women in India making photography. So Usma is very interested in alternative practices and in trying to adapt new ideas about technology and using old technologies to actually fabricate the work. So here she's taking the idea in this image. She's made an analog version of likes on Facebook. So she's put her picture up, and you can stamp a like on it. Similarly here as well. It's a kind of, she makes these portraits that are 1-minute exposures, so there's in this sort of analog way, and then she puts on it all these symbols that are coming out of current new technology. This is a young woman, Nandini Muthia. She's also trained abroad. She trained in England. Now lives back in Chennai, and she's made this series about Krishna, the Indian god Krishna, and in a kind of domestic setting. Krishna, you might know, is the kind of bacchanalian god in the Indian pantheon. He's the one who has a lot of women following him. I suppose he'd be in the news today for abusing all these women, but we won't go there now. Yeah. And he's blue because he was a Dravidian god, and so what they meant was that he's really black. They're quite beautiful color prints, and a very different way of thinking about Krishna in a picture. Pushpamala is also in South India, in Bangalore. She's older and has a longish history of making photographic self-portraits as various kind of female characters from Indian folklore, from Indian anthropology, and from Bollywood. This body of work came out of a residency at the Pompidou Center, where she cast herself in various well-known French paintings. So we have some of these. These are quite large scale also. And Dilip Prakash is somebody I met in India who's, again, very unprepossessing, not somebody who foreign curators really seem to meet, I think, because of he's maybe socially living in a kind of too Indian a way. So he's made a couple of series that we're going to have. This is one of the series. It's referring to dark bungalows, which are, when you travel around in India and go trekking and stuff, there are state-provided places to rest. And he shot them at night, so they're all like night views of these places. And the other series is What Was Home, and it's a kind of photo document of English, or not English, English-style Indian public schools, or private schools in Americanism, I suppose. Yeah, they're like boys' schools, boarding schools, where you send your kids away. And we're hoping to invite Ram Rahman, who's who's a kind of mature artist, photo artist in India, who lived in New York for a long time, who is grandmother was American and became an Indian dancer, and so on. And he's very interested in. He went to Yale, to architecture school, and he's an architectural photographer in the day, and so he's very interested in social issues and in architecture and the way modern India was built, literally. Some of you might be going to Paris Photo. If you go to the Pompidou Center, you'll see this installation. So we're hoping he's going to come and make something like this over here for us. Rux Media Collective are all over the world now, so they're probably one of our India's very successful art exports. They're the kind of people who get listed in who are the most powerful people in the art world, kind of thing. So there are 3 people. They came out of media school in Delhi. They can be very theoretical, but they're actually sending us some stories. I think, is it just one, or like picture stories with text? And then we're going to Anup Ray. He's very young. There's a bunch of very youngish, kind of in their 20s, photographers who hang out together. They appeal to me because, and again, Stephen sort of backed it up, that they're a kind of little scene unto themselves. You know, we're talking about a place that doesn't have photo schools, where it's hard to get involved with photography, or it's easy, you might become a commercial photographer, but it's hard to do your own kind of practice. And yet there are these pockets of people who manage to get very involved with it, and who've also loosened up what you can take pictures of, because when I first went to research in India, there was very generic kind of works being made, usually to do with landscapes and portraits and stuff like that. But here, they're into photographing each other. And so they're quite fluid, you know, gender fluid and everything. And they're quite willing to expose it to everyone. It's another new development through photography. I find in India that despite the kind of conservative leanings of the state and everything at the moment, and the terrible laws, that the young people somehow just finding a way through it. Mickey Roy, on the other hand, who's a friend of these people and their age, has a very unique background, though. He's one of India's railway children. India's railway stations are full of young kids who run away, and he was one of those. And he was taken into a kind of orphanage situation, and also a schooling situation, and so they offered them various trades, and Vicky was sent off to assist a commercial photographer, and he took to it. And so he's become a photographer, and one of his earliest kind of projects was to document other railway street children like himself. So we're going to show that body of work. It's unusual to get this kind of thing shot in this serious way by the kind of somebody who has a voice from within. photography is much and probably justifiably maligned because it's often shot by professionals from outside. And how do you give voice to the people inside, who are the subjects and never able to speak? Vidisha Saini is a young woman who just came back from getting her MFA at CalArts and has made this body of work which is about the eviction of people. It's the title is ironic. It says, "You like Mr. Shekhar?" So poor Mr. Shekhar lived in one of these houses, and the authorities came along and said, "You've got to move." So it's about this displacement, this forced displacement of people. Sticking with houses, this person, Hemant Sareen, who's again a kind of interesting newish person on the Indian scene, in the sense that he's a photo artist and not a commercial person, has made these very atmospheric and enigmatic pictures of his home life, which was very stark. It consisted of this house, which was slightly falling down, his mother, that's the mother, and their cats. They had a lot of stray cats. It's hard for me to describe. It's something visual, I think. When you see the pictures, hopefully, you'll see what we mean. This is just a still of a video installation. So basically it's looking at India and China. So it's looking at the kind of the great leaders in the two countries. It has a kind of ironic end, which you see in the video. Mithu Sen is a fine artist who's also doing quite well lately. She's Bengali. She studied at Shantiniketan, the school that Tagore started in West Bengal. She's made this very interesting video. I don't have the video part of it, but I can show you a detail. It's called "I Have Only One Language, It Is Not Mine." And she has gone to a home, a kind of residential home for women who, and she shot them. They're not really confined there, but it's kind of, it's a kind of rehab place, so they're not altogether well. But she's filmed them, and then she's altered the footage in this way, so it becomes sort of like almost like colored line drawing. But it's very interesting to see. This is Rishi Singhal, who also trained in this part of the world. He's a product of the course in Syracuse and a product of light work. He's now back in India, and it's a large format color documentation of the Ganges from its source down through the plains and out to the sea. So it's very classic 5/4 color, but he has the eye, so to speak, we thought. And also to show that people are still doing this. And like here, many people in photography there are turning back to analog and to film. Ishan Thankar is a young man who spent a lot of time with the so-called, not so-called, but the Maoists. The Maoists in the forest, again, in central India, they're actually tribal groups who've organized resistance to the mining companies who are backed by the Indian military. And he's made a book. We're going to be showing 7 images, I believe, and then he's going to he's made a sort of video of the book, so you can see the whole story. It's called A Peal of Spring Thunder. So nearly everywhere in India there seems to be trouble and strife as well, and the photographers aren't shying away from it. One of the things that draws me to India, and I feel very attached to it myself, is that it is a place where, despite our great government and our great leaders, you are able to say something. Indians feel free to express, and it's the thing that's saving it for the moment. I think if they ever lose that right to express, then we can say all is lost. So I'm going to end again on another woman, Anusha Yadav. She's based in Bombay. She's made this quite fun series of herself impersonating various female characters, some very domestic. So this is our last picture. This is her paternal grandmother. And so I just want to bring it back through the women to highlight the feudal kind of patriarchy that runs rife in India still, and how the paternal grandmothers collude in this and perpetuate the kind of oppression of women in India. So I'm going to end like that. And we'll open it, shall we? Oh, yeah, Anne.
Are there geographic tendencies in photography is different in Mumbai than in Delhi, than in the eastern areas or down south? I mean, or is it school related, or how does that component sort out?
Okay, I think it's not school-related yet because there are no schools. There's only one school. And the school is in Gujarat at NID. But it's, I think because, photography's followed the money, and the money's been in Bombay and more in Delhi now. So the industry's there. So although there are no schools, it's a huge industrial output of photography. India has print publications in many languages, servicing 1 billion people. There's a lot of print. There's a lot of photographs being made. But very little of it is kind of discussed or talked about in the way that we would be used to. So there's film education and film studies in Bombay and also in Delhi and in some of the universities, but I think if we're going to have a distinction, then we can say that, this is just my personal feeling from looking at it, is that the South Indians are closer to a more classical Indian culture, and I feel more able to make visual work that connects to that India's big tradition of depicting the gods and goddesses and all of that. And North Indians, Delhi and Bombay, and especially Bombay, are very westward looking. And so their work tends to be more urbane and more kind of, I guess, either very fine art in that kind of contemporary way, so not ethnically Indian looking, so to speak. That's the word I'm trying to find. But I think a bit like this country, practitioners, wherever they start, end up kind of migrating to metropolitan centers. And there are the 4 regional ones, although Calcutta's lost a lot of its clout, so people tend to go to either Bombay or Delhi. So it does make it a little problematic. So we wanted to survey widely, but if we go to a regional center, people say, well, there's so-and-so and so-and-so, but actually they're living in Bombay. It's like here with New York, it's like the coastal thing or something. So the power, and certainly the power of the art world is in the big metros, and I guess people want to be close to them. But India is not like China, where they've started a lot of schools and all that. What we have started in India are a lot of photo festivals. So they're happening. But they're being curated in a very strange, not strange, but in a kind of in the new kind of internet way. So, you know, by calls, and people send them JPEGs, and then they print them there, and they're selected by juries. And I think Yasu from here has just been in India on a jury, like one of those. I met him, he was in or out of there. So there's that kind of thing happening. There's not a lot happening. I'm very old school, as you know, so this is my second big effort on India, and all the curating I've ever done, you know, it's from scratch. We met at least 3 times as many as the people here in person. We sat in each of the cities and had appointments from morning till night. I mean, I find I have to meet the people to try to figure out what the practice is. I can't do it just from having JPEGs sent to me. But I think people are short of money and time or something. But the thing is this, yeah. I missed the second half of the question.
She asked if the photographer that led the ICP, how that happened. Was that photographer sent by their family, or was it a scholarship?
It was a scholarship. It's one of Devika's. There's a few fellowships now in India, fortunately. There's even now, I think, at least maybe 3 or 4 book publishing grants, photo book publishing grants being given locally. So there's an interesting group in Bombay that's a photo book collective that has events around photography books and self-publishing. Mickey Roy, the young kids that we talked about who are in Delhi, they started a mobile library of photography books, because in India, accessing photography books is a problem. So many older people who have the books have been giving it to them, and then they hold, on a weekend they'll suddenly appear somewhere and announce that there's a photo book library, come and have a look at the books, kind of thing. So there's sort of little initiatives like that, yeah. Okay. I think you have to tell.
He was asking about, because of the rise of digital technology,
Yeah.
photography through phones has become more commonplace.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well we saw an example of it with Uzma Mohsin's work, where she's taken iPhone technology, but she's using it in a very analog way. So they're kind of playing with it in that way, but the point you make is quite valid in a general way to the culture, because I always, I understand that India missed the laptop revolution, so when all you guys had a laptop, they missed that. Couldn't afford it. But what they do have now are mobile phones, and the numbers are staggering. 800 million Indians have a mobile phone, and they're taking snaps with them and sending them to each other and posting on Instagram. So for sheer volume, they'll beat the hell out of you in terms of picture production. So I wouldn't go there if I want. You can't compete. I was in a jury. Can I tell a little anecdote? Sorry. Okay, so I was in a jury in Toronto at the AGO. They have these photo prizes. They give $50,000 every year, and it's by public vote, and it's on the internet. So they have 4 photographers up every year and invite people to vote for the ones that they like. Well, the year they had the Indians there, we won hands down because, we have armies of people who go vote, 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 vote. It was won by Gauri Gill that year, I'm happy to say. She got the 50,000. I didn't get anything from her. I should have asked her for a cut. But it's a bit like the gay thing. I'm sorry, being gay is my other passion. So the Indians missed, gay liberation didn't happen. They completely missed India. They never heard of it. They didn't want to talk about it anyway. But suddenly now, they're all queer. Queer is really big and in, and they're all gender fluid and queer. That's absolutely fine. But they just missed the whole gay thing, So but they're catching up on all the rest of it now. So we started out saying we're very PC, so we have to be very inclusive. India's got a lot of, India's basically full of all kinds of minorities. And of course it's got a problem, like a gender problem, especially with photography, which has been a male-dominated profession, the commercial side of it anyway, for many years. Also, it's very hard for married women in India to continue with a profession that takes them out of the house or out of an officey situation. Because you probably know that there's a lot of Indian working women, but they go to work in one place, office, and then they come home. It's kind of, everybody knows where they are, basically they can't just wander off. So basically it's hard for them. So when we were trying to find the people, so we were looking out for different kinds of minorities in the Indian context to bring in. But then when we were selecting, we had to select things that we could show, that are not just there because of. So I think a number of the women in our project are fine artists who've used the camera. Shilpa Gupta, Pushpamala, and so on. Very few of them are primarily photographers. Uzma Mohsin is, Gauri Gill is, and Nandini is, but relatively few. Most are fine artists. So they're kind of more able to do that. The other thing is that the women artists who are successful in India, how should I put, they're single. They've managed to not get married. getting married is usually the end of your career. So that's... and so they're a little envious of the guys who are able to somehow have their domestic life and their work life. And I think our approach was not seen to be unusual for the subcontinent because higher education in India is government sponsored. So our art schools and our design schools, where the photography course is located, the one we went to visit, for example, all practice affirmative action. So they're well used to, there's a kind of fairly rigid quota system and everything to do with the Indian government, including employment. So except for these Guptas who kind of appear everywhere. So they're kind of a dominating, abusive, mercantile class of people who've come to the fore now. So yeah, sad to say. They are my cousins, but yeah, I know what they basically make money. Yeah.
Sunil, maybe it may be too early to ask this, since you gave us an alphabetical
Yeah.
of the artists, but I'm wondering how you and Stephen imagine structuring the show, whether you've sort of figured out how it all comes together in groupings of certain issues or modes of practice.
I think we've thought about grouping it either through similarity of practices. So there's this kind of kinship between the younger lot and like the older fine artists have a more established practice and kind of are almost standalone in a way. So we were actually did a walkthrough of the space. Part of the problem was that I had to, I have been here before, but I didn't look at it with that kind of eye. Today is the first time I looked at what the space is, and so we were discussing where things might go. I don't think, when I did a project called Where Three Dreams Cross, where we had 5 thematics within, I don't think we ever had that kind of plan here, which was family and so on. But that was connecting things across time, because it was a historical show, so I think the larger point that we might want to make is that India as a society has radically changed since 1994. Therefore, we're looking at post-2000. We're looking at the consequences of economic liberalization. We have a very young demographic. The average Indian is in his 20s. The average this young urban Indian, not the rural ones, has money in his pocket, and commerce has come forward to help him spend it. So suddenly, metropolitan centers in India are awash with Starbucks, bars, shops to global shopping kind of things. So and the kids seem to change jobs every other year. So there's obviously they're not unemployed, or they're not afraid of being unemployed like the West. And when it comes to social justice and rights, they're very impatient also, They want those rights soon. They don't want to wait, and they don't want to compromise like, say, maybe my generation did. So what's going to happen? I think there's an interesting thing we could explore with the family. There's in the larger bodies of work, there is this upheaval, and it's being expressed. There's a kind of violent social change of the forests and the tribals and the borders. All the borders are in upheaval, north, south, east, west, kind of thing. And I think finally there's a kind of lie that was sold to them about the present regime is trying to sell about again in the Indian way of a return to some kind of heroic historic past that these young people are challenging. So, but I think as a kind of walking through it, I think it'd be good to group some of the young urban stuff together, and maybe some of the gender sexuality thing, and then maybe keep the trouble and strife part separate in a way, because they don't.
Too early to ask.
Something you said yesterday.
We should go to dinner and then we figure it out. So.
Something you said yesterday I thought was really interesting, where you were talking about you were comparing different cultures and the voices, and you were talking about the complexity and the contradiction in the Indian perspectives and voices, which I thought was fascinating. And so one thing I was thinking about when we were walking through the spaces today were how the artists might have conversations with one another.
Yeah.
We'll work that out.
I think so. I mean, if I can refer to a non-Indian quote, so Susan Sontag in The Pain of Others talked about the subject and about talking about, what makes you able to, how can you can't talk for other people, you can just like offer sympathy, maybe. But you certainly can't speak in their voice, and that's what has happened in many instances that one is aware of. I mean, for example, with, say, take AIDS, this global thing, and the way it played out with NGOs. And in India, it played out in this terrible way, where the actual suffering street queens were spoken for by AIDS NGOs who were paid a lot of money in salary, but the people affected were just data, and they just lived and died, and nobody really did very much about their lives in actual fact. So in that way, you know what I mean? So I think these younger ones are more aware of, whereas someone like Pablo, who's the prominent photojournalist, he works in a more, if you like, Western, more old-fashioned way, in the sense that he gets assignments. So, he goes to California to shoot Indian farmers, or to the people working with or against Cesar Chavez and all of that back in the 90s, and then does something similar more recently in Mauritius, in Portugal, in Leicester, in England, with displaced Indians from Africa. But he might be Indian, but he's equally a kind of outsider. It may as well be anybody, but what he brings is his skill and the kind of picture making that he does. And he's a typical professional photojournalist, kind of outsider himself, actually. He's an interesting character. I mean, a lot of these people are interesting characters. Pablo's father was Burmese, was a refugee from the Japanese in the Second World War. He lives in India, always under a slight cloud of suspicion, like a bit alien. It's a bit like me in India, because my mother's Tibetan, so Indians look at me like, really, am I really one of them? I don't look like my cousins at all. And so in 1962, when I was little and they had a war with China, I was very unpopular, I too, because, yeah, so like that. So I think photography attracts that kind of thing. So there are some global similarities, I would say. And the thing about not having, I mean, I'm trying to see a benefit in not having a photography history, which they don't have. So they're desperately trying to, now with the internet, they can see a lot of things and kind of teach themselves or something. But so they're making pictures, you see, without this, the weight and or the baggage, if you like, of Edward Western, etc., to live up to, because they don't have anything like that. They can do whatever, you know, which they do, and so then they borrow and steal from everywhere and come up with a kind of hybrid, as you can see. There's no. So I guess in a way to go back to the question, there's no developed schools of thought to organize the show into because they're not there as yet. 5 years ago when I did the other project, when people asked me what's Indian photography, I said there's no such thing yet because they haven't worked it out. It's going to take some time. There's Indian art, and that's based on long traditions, but there's no similar, even 100, although there is 100 years of photography in India, it's not in this kind of studied way. There haven't been people like you guys studying and writing it. There are no books on it or anything. There's like 2 books. We were trying to think, where are the books? I mean, where are the kind of critical books? There's plenty of coffee table picture books, but no critique. There's no proper publications. I tried to be a one-man band there when I was living there. Gauri, Gill and I started a version of camera work because I was once involved with camera work in London. We started one called Camera Work Daily, where we gave it out for free, but we wanted to have a print publication that talked about photography and criticized things and reviewed shows and all of that, and just to have a place to have a discussion. And people said, oh, it should be on the internet, but we thought, no, it's a print medium, it needs to be on paper, and stuff like that. So yeah, it's and now they have a lot of book and self-published, so they're getting the hang of it. But I'm sure it's going to certainly arrive there because it's a very popular thing to do, pictures. And throughout the time the great history of photographies were being made, photography was very expensive, so they couldn't afford it. So my father's generation went to the studio to have a picture taken. They didn't have a camera at home. That's quite new. But visual culture comes from cinema in India. I grew up like that. So I grew up with big blockbuster song and dance, colorful melodramas. It's probably why I'm gay now. But anyway, that's and so yeah, that's I think what informs them also. There's quite a lot of sort of cinematic stuff happening. Yeah. The way they. Yeah. No, there was, but the thing is, it's only now being researched. So just very recently, like just some months back, there's been a show in Bombay of a guy who worked in Bollywood cinema in the 40s. And I did meet the guy, Nimai Ghosh, who was the still photographer for Satyajit Ray in Calcutta. And he wouldn't give us any pictures. So he was doing his own book. The other thing in India is that they're very suspicious. So aside, they're very argumentative, but they're very suspicious, and they won't give you the pictures. So that's another problem. There's a very interesting Indian photographer from, mind you, we're not looking at history, but I'll tell you a historical story about Sunil Gupta. He worked in the 20s and 30s and 40s. In Calcutta, he was the photographer for the Communist Party of India in Calcutta. So he covered a lot of social stuff and the demise of the empire, but also the wartime and the famine and all that. And he's the guy who was the guide for Margaret Bourke-White. He took her to all the places, and so and so they couldn't, and so when they wouldn't pay him for the pictures in India, so he put them in a suitcase and arrived in Wimbledon, outside London, in a London suburb, and lived with them for quite a long time. That's where I met him, and they were just literally in his suitcase was was his history of Indian photography from that period, quite precious. And then next thing we knew, he became very frail, and his son lived in California. And the next thing is Mr. Jana and negatives and all went to live in California. And now he's died, and now the son won't give you the pictures. So, and so God knows what's going to happen to them. So it's a bit like that. Like I've been researching, queer archives in India, and they're destroyed by the people because they're or by the families. There was a guy coming with a bunch of pictures he'd made over a lifetime running a tea plantation in Darjeeling, where he had developed an interest in the local mountain boys, and he had all these pictures of them, which sounded very interesting. And then on the way down, he met an accident and he died, and his family destroyed them before anybody could see them. So all that kind of thing goes on. I think you're very lucky here because you've been able to create institutions that can look after and encourage people to donate material to you, so you're able to find it. And I think the interest can be theirs, but there's no institutional support for it or anything.
One of the aspects of the biennial before we say goodnight that I think is important to mention here is that there will be a hardcover scholarly book with essays in it that will help add to the scholarship of what's happening now and place it in a context that will, I think, be a good step for recognition for these artists.
Yeah, I think definitely, because we're very short of, I was saying earlier that we're very short of, generally in photography, on publications that are not the canon. Because I teach in London in 2 British art schools, and I have very little to teach with, aside from things that I might bring personally, but the library is very short on things. So British photography has become bloody Martin Parr, And we're thinking, why is it Martin Parr yet again? Another straight white guy, he just opened a foundation for God's sake, and And there's so many other things happening, but it's like they're just very content to have this one person. And everywhere you go, he's there. It's just a nightmare. What about me? You know, so yeah. And then what about me? Like, I am worried. I'm going to die soon. And my pictures will disappear. I mean, I'll leave them to Stephen. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it's... I was going to say, I think it's very important that Fotofest has brought it here, that you're going to have this, and that some of you will carry it with you, and that's very important that the word gets out. So thank you very much. Okay.